The stagecoach door swung open, and Eleanor Carter stepped onto the dusty platform of Willow Creek Station, her face streaked with tears she no longer bothered to hide. Samuel Hayes, the rancher who'd sent for a mail-order bride, watched his future wife arrive not with the smile from her photograph, but with shoulders shaking from silent sobs. In that moment, instead of disappointment or anger, Samuel did something that would change both their lives forever. He stepped forward, offered her his worn handkerchief, and spoke words that cut through her despair. "You don't have to pretend with me." Dear listeners, settle in as I share this remarkable tale of courage, redemption, and unexpected love in the American frontier. And please comment below which city you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. The October wind carried the scent of sage and distant rain across the Wyoming territory, as Samuel Hayes adjusted his best Sunday coat for the third time that afternoon. He stood on the wooden platform of Willow Creek Station, a modest structure that served as the gateway between civilization and the vast, untamed frontier he called home. His calloused hands testimony to years of working. The land fidgeted with the small photograph he'd carried in his breast pocket for the past 3 months. Eleanor Carter's image stared back at him, a woman with intelligent eyes and a tentative smile dressed in what appeared to be her finest Boston attire. Her letters had painted a picture of an educated woman seeking adventure and purpose in the West. Someone who understood that life on a ranch demanded more grit than glamour. Samuel had read those letters so many times he could recite passages from memory, each word carefully penned in elegant handwriting that spoke of refinement and education. But the woman who emerged from the stagecoach bore little resemblance to the composed figure in the photograph. Eleanor's traveling dress, a deep burgundy wool that had once been fashionable in Boston's better circles, was now dusty and wrinkled from the long journey. Her auburn hair, which she'd carefully pinned that morning in Denver, had come partially undone wisps framing a face marked by exhaustion and something deeper, a raw, wounded vulnerability that made Samuel's chest tighten with unexpected protectiveness. The tears came freely now, no longer the careful, hidden weeping of a lady maintaining propriety, but the exhausted surrender of someone who had finally reached the end of a terrible journey. Her gloved hands trembled as she gripped her worn valise knuckles white beneath the fabric, as if that simple bag contained everything left of her former life. The other passengers disembarking gave her a wide berth, their curious glances mixing sympathy with the harsh judgment frontier folk often reserved for emotional displays. A woman traveling alone to meet a husband she'd never seen in person was already cause for whispers. Arriving in tears would fuel gossip for months. Samuel moved without conscious thought, his long strides covering the distance between them in seconds. Up close, he could see the red rims around her green eyes, the way her bottom lip trembled despite her obvious effort to still it. She looked up at him, this tall, broad-shouldered stranger who would be her husband, and something in her expression shattered completely. "Miss Carter," he said quietly, his voice carrying the gentle rumble of distant thunder. "I'm Samuel Hayes." She tried to speak, to offer some greeting or explanation, but only managed a choked sob. Her free hand flew to her mouth, mortification flooding her features. This was not how she'd imagined this moment, during the endless miles from Boston through Chicago, across the endless prairies. She'd rehearsed cheerful greetings, practiced the smile that would assure him he'd made the right choice, planned the careful words that would begin their new life together. Instead, she stood before him, broken and exposed, the carefully constructed facade she'd maintained for 3,000 miles, finally crumbling at the very moment she needed it most. Samuel reached into his pocket, not for the ring he'd had made by the silversmith in Cheyenne, but for his handkerchief clean but softened by years of use. He offered it to her with the same quiet certainty he'd used to calm a spooked horse, no judgment in his weathered face, only an unexpected understanding. "You don't have to pretend with me," he said, the words carrying across the platform like a promise. "Whatever brought you here, whoever you were before, that's between you and the good Lord. Out here we judge folks by what they do, not what's been done to them." Eleanor took the handkerchief with shaking fingers, their hands brushing briefly his rough and warm, hers cold, despite the afternoon sun. She dabbed at her eyes, struggling to compose herself while processing his words. They were nothing like the formal pleasantries she'd expected, nothing like the stern assessment she'd feared. Instead, they offered something she hadn't dared hope for: acceptance without conditions. I'm sorry, she managed finally, her voice hoarse from crying. This isn't. I didn't mean to. No need for apologies, Samuel interrupted gently. He picked up her valise with easy strength, his other hand hovering near her elbow, not quite touching, but ready to steady her if needed. My wagon's just over there. We can talk on the ride to the ranch, or not talk at all. Your choice. The wagon was practical rather than fancy sturdy wood reinforced with iron, built to withstand the harsh demands of ranch life. Samuel had spread a clean blanket over the bench seat and secured a canvas cover that could be raised against sun or rain. These small preparations, evidence of forethought and care, threatened to bring fresh tears to Eleanor's eyes. He helped her up with surprising gentleness for such a large man, waiting until she was settled before climbing up beside her. The horses, a matched pair of bays, stood patient and well-trained, their coats gleaming with health. Everything about Samuel's outfit spoke of a man who took care of what was his, who understood that survival on the frontier demanded attention to details. As they pulled away from the station, Eleanor caught glimpses of the town. Willow Creek was larger than she'd expected, with a proper main street lined with businesses. There was a general store with glass windows, a bank built of brick, a church with a white steeple pointing toward heaven. Signs of civilization that both comforted and worried her. More people meant more questions, more explanations, more chances for her past to poison her future. The ranch is about an hour north, Vic, Samuel said, his voice cutting through her spiraling thoughts. Good land, plenty of water. I've got 300 head of cattle, some horses, enough hands to manage it all proper. The house isn't fancy, but it's solid. Built it myself 3 years back with room to grow. He paused, glancing at her sideways. Your letters said you could cook and keep house. That true, or just what you figured I wanted to hear? Despite everything, Eleanor felt her lips twitch toward what might have been a smile. Both, she admitted. I can cook and clean and sew and do figures. I taught school for 3 years so I can read and write better than most. But yes, I also told you what I thought you wanted to hear. A woman seeking a marriage by mail can't afford complete honesty. Can't she? Samuel asked mildly. Seems to me starting a marriage on lies is like building a house on sand. Might stand for a while, but the first storm will knock it flat. Eleanor studied his profile, strong jaw shadowed with a day's growth of beard, deep lines around his eyes that spoke of years squinting into the sun, a nose that had been broken at least once. Not handsome in the classical sense, but there was something solid about him, something that suggested he meant what he said. Then I should tell you, she began, her voice catching. I'm not the woman you think you're getting. I'm not some adventurous spinster seeking excitement in the West. I'm here because I had nowhere else to go. Samuel kept his eyes on the road ahead, giving her space to continue. The horse's hooves kicked up small clouds of dust that hung in the still air, and somewhere in the distance a hawk cried out, lonely and wild. There was a scandal. Eleanor continued each word, feeling like glass in her throat. False accusations that ruined my reputation, cost me my position, made me unemployable in any decent establishment. I tried to fight it, tried to clear my name, but when powerful people decide you're guilty, innocence becomes irrelevant. She waited for him to pull the wagon around to take her back to the station, to put her on the next stage heading anywhere but here. Instead, Samuel made a thoughtful noise in his throat and asked, This scandal, did you do what they said you did? No. The word came out fierce and immediate. Never. I would never. But that didn't matter. The damage was done. My landlady evicted me, afraid of the association. My friends, such as they were, suddenly found themselves too busy to receive me. Even my church suggested I might be more comfortable worshiping elsewhere. Samuel was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. Then, Boston's loss, seems to me. Their idea of scandal probably wouldn't even raise an eyebrow out here. We've got former soldiers who've done things in war. They'll never speak of women who've survived things that would break most menfolks running from all manner of past troubles. What matters is who you are now, what you're willing to work for. You're not angry about me not telling you in my letters. He shrugged, a gesture that seemed to encompass the vast landscape around them. Would you have told a stranger something that painful? Something that personal letters are for presenting our best selves. It's face-to-face where truth lives. They rode in companionable silence for a while, the rhythm of the horse's gait and the creak of wagon wheels creating a strange kind of peace. Eleanor found herself studying the landscape so different from Boston's crowded streets and narrow alleys. Here the sky seemed endless, painted in shades of blue she hadn't known existed. The mountains rose in the distance like slumbering giants, their peaks already dusted with early snow. "It's beautiful," she said softly, surprised to find she meant it. "Wait until you see it at sunrise," Samuel replied, warming to the subject. "The light hits those peaks and turns them gold and pink like God's own painting. And in spring, when the wildflowers bloom, the whole valley looks like a patchwork quilt." His love for the land was evident in every word, and Eleanor felt something ease in her chest. This was a man who found beauty in simple things, who built his life on solid ground rather than society's shifting opinions. "Tell me about the ranch," she encouraged, wanting to hear more of that warmth in his voice. Samuel obliged, describing the lay of the land, the creek that never ran dry even in drought years, the barn he'd raised with the help of neighbors, the vegetable garden that needed tending. He spoke of his horses with particular affection, especially a mare named Buttercup, who had a tendency to pick pockets looking for treats. "The house has 4 rooms," he explained. "Kitchen, main room, and 2 bedrooms. Indoor pump for water had that installed last year. No bathroom inside yet, but the outhouse is close and clean. I've been planning to add on maybe a proper parlor for company, but wanted to wait until—" He trailed off, and Eleanor understood. Until he had a wife's opinion on such matters. Until he wasn't planning alone anymore. "The kitchen gets good morning light, bite?" she asked, trying to picture this new life. "Eastern exposure, Tau," he confirmed. "Previous owner's wife insisted on it, said bread rose better in morning sun. Don't know if that's true, but it does make for pleasant mornings with coffee." As they talked, Eleanor felt the tight knot of anxiety in her stomach beginning to loosen. Samuel didn't pepper her with questions about Boston, didn't demand details about the scandal. Instead, he painted a picture of a life that was hard, but honest, demanding, but rewarding. "There's something else you should know," he said as they crested a hill. "The reason I sent for a wife through the mail rather than courting local women." Eleanor tensed, preparing for some terrible revelation. Was he a drunkard? Violent? Had he killed someone? "I was married before," Samuel said quietly. "Sarah was her name. We were young, full of dreams about building something grand out here. But the winter of '71 was brutal. She caught pneumonia, and I couldn't get her to a doctor in time. She died in my arms, delirious with fever, calling for her mother." The pain in his voice was old, but still sharp, like a scar that ached in bad weather. Eleanor's hand moved without her conscious decision, covering his where it rested on his knee. His skin was warm in rough hands that knew work and weather. "I'm sorry, she said, meaning it deeply. "It's been 2 years, why," Samuel continued. "Neighbors keep pushing their daughters at me, well-meaning folks who think a man can't manage alone. But every time I looked at those girls, all I could see was Sarah, at their age, young and bright and full of hope I couldn't protect. I wanted someone who'd already been tested by life, who understood that the frontier takes as much as it gives." "Someone already broken?" Eleanor asked, a bitter note creeping into her voice. "Someone already strong," Samuel corrected firmly. "Takes strength to survive what you've survived to travel across the country to marry a stranger. That's not broken, Miss Carter. That's brave." They topped another rise, and Samuel pointed ahead. "There. That's home." The ranch spread before them in the afternoon light, more impressive than Eleanor had expected. The house was indeed simple, but well built, with a covered porch and glass windows that caught the sun. The barn was huge and solid, painted red with white trim. Corrals held horses that raised their heads to watch their approach, and in the distance she could see cattle grazing on the golden grass. But what struck her most was the garden plot near the house, fenced against rabbits and deer, with neat rows of vegetables and what looked like a small orchard of young fruit trees. Someone had planted flowers too, not practical, just beautiful. Roses climbed a trellis against the house, and sunflowers nodded along the fence line. "Sarah's garden," Samuel explained, following her gaze. "I've tried to keep it up. Figured whoever came after deserved something pretty, to look at something that was just theirs if they wanted it." The thoughtfulness of it, the careful tending of his dead wife's garden for a woman he'd never met, brought fresh tears to Eleanor's eyes. But these were different from the desperate tears at the station. These were tears of possibility of hope she'd thought lost forever. As they pulled up to the house, a man emerged from the barn, older, grizzled, with the bow-legged walk of a lifetime horseman. He approached the wagon, eyeing Eleanor with curious but not unkind interest. "This is Jake Morrison," Samuel said. "My foreman and friend. Jake, this is Miss Eleanor Carter, my intended." Jake touched the brim of his hat respectfully. "Ma'am, welcome to the Double H Ranch." "Thank you, Mr. Morrison." Eleanor managed, grateful her voice came out steady. "Just Jake, ma'am. We don't stand much on ceremony out here." He looked at Samuel. "That bull's been acting up again. Might want to check the fence in the north pasture before dark." Samuel nodded, but didn't immediately move to handle the problem. Instead, he helped Eleanor down from the wagon, retrieved her valise, and led her to the house. Inside, everything was clean but sparse functional furniture, a few books on a shelf, no decorations save for a single photograph on the mantel. "That's Sarah," Samuel said, following her gaze. "I'll put it away if you'd prefer." Eleanor studied the image, a young woman with a sweet smile and gentle eyes. "No," she said finally. "She was part of your life, part of what made you who you are. Hiding her away won't change that." Samuel's expression softened with something that might have been gratitude. "You must be tired. The bedroom through there is yours. I'll bunk in the barn until we're properly married. There's water in the pitcher and the outhouse is behind the garden. I need to see to that fence, but I'll be back before dark. We can discuss arrangements then." He paused at the door, looking back at her, standing in the middle of his home, their home potentially. "Miss Carter Eleanor, I want you to know something. I didn't send for a wife just for cooking and cleaning. I've managed that myself for 2 years. I sent for a partner, someone to build something with. If that's not what you're looking for, if you just need a roof over your head until something better comes along, I understand. But I'd rather know now." Eleanor met his steady gaze, seeing in it an honesty that Boston society, for all its pretensions to propriety, had never offered her. "Mr. Hayes?" "Samuel. I came here with nothing but hope and desperation. I don't know if I can be the partner you're looking for, if I can learn to love this land like you do, if I can fill the spaces in your life that need filling, but I want to try. If you'll have me knowing what you now know, I want to try." He nodded once, decisive. "Then we'll try together. Rest now. Tomorrow, we'll start sorting out the details." After he left, Eleanor stood alone in the quiet house, afternoon sun slanting through clean windows. She walked slowly through the rooms, taking inventory. The kitchen was well stocked with supplies and equipment, everything organized logically. The main room held 2 chairs before the fireplace, one obviously Samuel's, the other Sarah's, waiting for an occupant. The bedroom Samuel had indicated as hers was small but pleasant, with a handmade quilt on the iron bed and a washstand with a mirror. Someone Samuel had placed a small vase on the windowsill filled with the last wildflowers of the season. She sat on the bed testing the mattress and finally allowed herself to fully process the day. This morning she'd awakened on the stagecoach stiff and anxious, wondering if she'd made the worst mistake of her life. Now she sat in a clean, quiet room in a solid house on a prosperous ranch with a man who seemed inclined to judge her by her future rather than her past. It wasn't the life she'd planned back when she was a respectable school teacher with a tidy room in a boarding house and a position among Boston's educated class. But that life had been built on foundations she hadn't realized were fragile reputation, social standing, the good opinion of people who'd abandoned her at the first whisper of scandal. This life, whatever it became, would be built on different foundations. Work, certainly. Hardship, probably. But also honesty, partnership, and the vast possibility of a frontier that didn't care about Boston's social register. Eleanor unpinned her traveling hat, setting it carefully on the dresser. She poured water from the pitcher, washing the dust and tears from her face. In the mirror, she hardly recognized herself. Skin already touched by the western sun eyes that had lost their city softness. She looked like someone who might survive out here, might even thrive. Through the window, she could see Samuel in the distance, working on the fence Jake had mentioned. He moved with economical grace, every motion purposeful. Other men had joined him, ranch hands, she supposed, and she could hear their distant laughter carried on the wind. It was a sound of camaraderie, of shared purpose, something she'd rarely heard in Boston's careful social gatherings. As the sun began its descent toward the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Samuel had promised she'd come to love Eleanor made a decision. She would not merely survive here. She would not simply go through the motions of being a rancher's wife, cooking and cleaning and counting days. She would build a life. She would learn to ride horses and tend cattle, to read the weather in the sky and the seasons in the land. She would plant her own flowers next to Sarah's roses, not to replace them, but to add to them. She would make this house a home not just for Samuel, but for herself. The tears that had marked her arrival were gone now, dried by prairie wind and gentle acceptance. In their place was something Eleanor hadn't felt in months: determination. Boston had broken her, yes, but it hadn't destroyed her. And maybe, just maybe, that breaking had been necessary to reshape her into someone who could thrive in this wild, honest place. When Samuel returned as promised, just as the last light was fading, he found Eleanor in the kitchen investigating the stove and supplies. She'd changed from her traveling dress into a simple calico work dress, her hair repinned in a practical style. "I thought I'd make supper," she said, suddenly shy. "If that's acceptable." "More than acceptable," Samuel replied, pleasure evident in his voice. "I've been living on my own cooking for too long. Jake threatens to quit every time I make stew." "How bad can it be?" Eleanor asked, finding a pot and checking its cleanliness. "I once made biscuits that the dog wouldn't eat. We use them now to patch holes in the barn wall." Despite everything, the exhaustion, the emotion, the uncertainty, Eleanor laughed. It surprised her, the sound rusty from disuse, but genuine. Samuel smiled in response, the expression transforming his weathered face, and suddenly the kitchen felt warmer, more like a place where a life could be built. "Well then," Eleanor said, rolling up her sleeves with mock seriousness. "We'd better make sure you're fed properly before Jake leads a revolt. Point me toward the flour and whatever meat you've got, and I'll see what can be done." As she began preparing their first meal together, Samuel settled at the kitchen table, content to watch and occasionally direct her to supplies. They talked as she worked, simple things like where he bought provisions, which neighbors were helpful, what vegetables grew best in the garden. It wasn't romantic in the traditional sense. There were no flowers or poetry, no declarations of instant love. But there was something better, the beginning of partnership of two damaged people choosing to build something new from the ruins of their separate pasts. When Eleanor finally placed a plate before him, beef and potatoes with gravy biscuits that were light and flaky green beans she'd found preserved in jars, Samuel took a bite and closed his eyes in apparent bliss. "Jake's never going to quit now, he said. "He'll probably try to adopt you." "He'll have to stand in line," Eleanor replied, then blushed at her own boldness. But Samuel just grinned, that transformative expression that made him look years younger. "Good thing I saw you first, then." They ate in companionable silence as full dark settled over the ranch. Through the window, Eleanor could see stars beginning to appear. More stars than she'd ever seen in Boston, a vast canopy of light that made the sky seem infinite with possibility. "Tomorrow," Samuel said as they cleared the dishes together. "I'll show you around properly. Introduce you to the horses, walk the property lines, maybe go to town for supplies. And we should discuss the wedding. I figure a week would give you time to settle in, make sure this is what you want. That acceptable? A week to decide her entire future." It should have terrified her. Instead, Eleanor felt only calm certainty. "That's acceptable," she agreed. Later, after Samuel had retreated to the barn and Eleanor had prepared for bed, she stood at her window looking out at the vast darkness of the frontier. Somewhere out there were wolves and bears, storms and droughts, hardships she couldn't yet imagine. But also somewhere out there were spring wildflowers and mountain sunrises, neighbors who would judge her by her actions rather than her past, and the possibility of a love built on truth rather than pretense. She thought about the woman who'd stepped off that stagecoach in tears, broken by scandal and betrayal, carrying nothing but desperate hope. That woman felt like a stranger now, someone from another life. The woman standing at this window. Eleanor Carter, soon to be Eleanor Hayes, was someone new, someone stronger, someone who didn't need to pretend to deserve kindness, who could accept comfort without shame. who could build a future without hiding from the past. The oil lamp flickered, casting dancing shadows on the wall. Outside, she could hear the low murmur of voices from the barn. Samuel talking with Jake, and the hands, the comfortable sound of men who worked together and trusted each other. It was a sound that promised she wouldn't be alone here, that this ranch was more than land and cattle. It was a community, a place where people looked out for each other. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. She would need to prove herself capable, to earn the respect of the ranch hands, to learn the 1,000 skills survival here required. There would be mistakes and frustrations, moments of doubt, and probably more tears. But tonight, for the first time in months, Eleanor Carter went to bed without fear. The man who'd met her at the station, that quiet, steady man who'd offered her his handkerchief and his acceptance, had given her something more precious than shelter or security. He'd given her the freedom to stop pretending, to stop running, to stop apologizing for existing. "You don't have to pretend with me," he'd said, and in those 6 words had offered her what Boston never had the chance to be herself, flawed and strong, broken, and brave exactly as she was. As sleep finally claimed her, Eleanor's last thought was a prayer of gratitude, not for rescue or salvation, but for the simple gift of a new beginning earned not through deception or careful facades, but through the revolutionary act of truth. The autumn wind sang through the valley, carrying the scent of sage and possibility, and the Double H Ranch settled into peaceful darkness, holding within its borders 2 wounded souls who'd chosen to heal together one honest moment at a time. The morning arrived with a chorus of roosters and the low bellowing of cattle sounds that pulled Eleanor from the deepest sleep she'd had in months. For a moment she lay still, disoriented by the unfamiliar ceiling, the scent of wood smoke and leather that permeated everything here. Then memory rushed back the station, the tears, Samuel's steady kindness, and her decision to stop running. She dressed quickly in her simplest dress, a brown wool that wouldn't show dirt easily, and pinned her hair in a practical bun. Through the window, she could see Samuel already at work leading a horse from the barn, while Jake and 2 other men loaded tools into a wagon. The sun was barely over the horizon, painting everything in shades of gold and rose, just as Samuel had promised. In the kitchen, she found the stove already warm. Someone had stoked it before dawn. A pot of coffee sat on the back burner, strong and black, with a note beside it. In unpracticed handwriting, "Didn't want to wake you. Back by noon. S." The thoughtfulness of it made her chest tight with an emotion she couldn't quite name. When was the last time someone had shown her such simple consideration? Not the elaborate courtesies of Boston society, all show and no substance, but this practical kindness that cost nothing and meant everything. Eleanor poured herself a cup of coffee, savoring its bitter warmth, and set about exploring her new domain more thoroughly. The pantry was well stocked but disorganized, clearly managed by someone who grabbed what was needed without much thought to system. She found flour and beans, salt pork, and preserved vegetables, even a precious tin of peaches that must have cost dear at the general store. By the time the sun was fully up, she had bread-rising beans soaking for dinner and a mental list of everything that needed doing. The house was clean enough, but it lacked those small touches that made a place feel like home. No curtains on the windows, no tablecloth on the rough wooden table, no cushions on the hard chairs. Sarah's garden might bloom outside, but inside the house still felt like a man camping in his own life rather than living it. She was sweeping the porch when she heard horses approaching. Not Samuel's wagon, but riders moving fast. 3 men crested the hill, and Eleanor's stomach dropped as she recognized the type well-dressed in a way that suggested money rather than work with the confident bearing of those used to getting their way. The leader, a man with silver temples and cold blue eyes, dismounted without invitation, his gaze taking in every detail of her appearance with an assessment that made her skin crawl. She'd seen that look before in Boston from men who viewed unchaperoned women as either opportunities or problems. "You must be the new bride," he said, his voice carrying an accent that spoke of Eastern education. "Thomas Hartley. I own the Triple Bar Ranch to the south." He said it like she should be impressed. And perhaps she should be. Even in her short time here, she'd heard the Triple Bar mentioned with the mixture of respect and resentment reserved for the truly wealthy. "Miss Carter," she replied, not offering her hand, not stepping down from the porch. "Mr. Hayes isn't here at present." "I know exactly where Hayes is," Hartley said, his smile not reaching his eyes.
Mending fence on the border between our properties. Fence that wouldn't need mending if he'd accept my very generous offer to buy him out. The two men with him spread out slightly, not quite threatening, but definitely intentional. Eleanor recognized the tactic intimidation dressed up as conversation. She'd seen it used against her in Boston when the headmaster's son had first begun his campaign to ruin her.
"I'm afraid I don't discuss business matters," she said, keeping her voice level despite the way her heart hammered against her ribs. "You'll need to speak with Mr. Hayes directly." Hartley climbed the porch steps uninvited, stopping just close enough to make her uncomfortable. "Come now, surely a woman of your background understands the value of a good offer. I've heard all about you, Miss Carter. News travels fast out here, especially when someone arrives in tears at the station." The words hit like a slap, but Eleanor had taken worse. She lifted her chin, meeting his gaze directly. "Then you've heard I'm to be married within the week. I believe that makes any business between you and Mr. Hayes exactly that, between you and Mr. Hayes." "Marriage," Hartley mused, reaching out as if to touch a strand of her hair that had escaped its pins. "Such a permanent solution to a temporary problem. A woman like you, educated, refined, you don't belong out here playing house with a stubborn rancher who can barely make his mortgage payments." Eleanor stepped back, but her voice remained steady. "What I belong to is none of your concern, Mr. Hartley. I'll ask you to leave now." "Ask?" His eyebrows rose in mock surprise. "A woman alone asking three men to leave, that's brave. Or foolish. Hard to tell sometimes." The sound of a rifle being cocked cut through the morning air like thunder. Jake Morrison stood at the corner of the house, Winchester aimed steady at Hartley's chest. "The lady asked you to leave, Hartley. I'd listen if I were you." Hartley's face darkened with anger, but he stepped back. "Just trying to be neighborly, Jake. Welcome the new bride properly." "Your kind of welcome leaves bruises," Jake said flatly. "Get on your horse and get off Double H land. Don't come back unless Samuel invites you, which we both know ain't likely." For a moment, violence hung in the air like smoke. Then Hartley laughed cold and sharp. "This isn't over, Jake. Hayes can't hold out forever, and when he falls, I'll be there to pick up the pieces. All the pieces." His gaze lingered on Eleanor with implications that made her stomach turn. Then he mounted his horse with practiced ease. The three men rode off at a gallop, dust clouds marking their retreat. Jake lowered the rifle, but didn't put it away. "You all right, ma'am?" Eleanor realized she was shaking, adrenaline making her hands tremble. "Yes." "Thank you, Jake. Would he have—" "Hartley's too smart for outright violence," Jake said, spitting tobacco juice with evident disgust. "But he's been pressuring Samuel for 2 years now, ever since Sarah died. Figures a man alone is easier to break than one with something to fight for. Seen you here that probably stuck in his craw something fierce." "The mortgage payments," Eleanor said carefully. "Is the ranch in trouble?" Jake studied her for a long moment, clearly weighing how much to share. "It's tight," he admitted finally. "Bad winter 2 years back killed some stock, and beef prices haven't been what they should be. Samuel's been making payments, but just barely. Hartley knows it keeps offering to buy him out for less than half what the place is worth." "Why does he want it so badly?" "Water rights," Jake said simply. "The creek that runs through here is the best water source for miles. Control that you control the whole valley. Hartley's got dreams of building a cattle empire, and the Double H is the key to it all." Eleanor absorbed this information, understanding now the weight Samuel carried beyond his grief. He wasn't just fighting for a ranch. He was fighting for his independence, his legacy, his right to exist on his own terms. "Samuel's a good man," Jake continued, his weathered face serious. "Better than most, but he's been fighting alone for too long. Sarah's death nearly broke him, and Hartley's been picking at the cracks ever since. Maybe having you here will give him something to fight for besides just surviving another day." Before Eleanor could respond, Jake touched his hat brim and walked away, leaving her alone with thoughts that churned like storm clouds. She'd come here seeking refuge, but it seemed she'd walked into another battle entirely. The difference was this time she wouldn't be fighting alone. When Samuel returned at noon as promised, Eleanor had lunch waiting, thick sandwiches and fresh coffee, nothing fancy but filling. He looked tired, dust coating everything, a new tear in his shirt where barbed wire had caught him. "Heard you had visitors," he said carefully, washing his hands at the pump. Mr. Hartley introduced himself, Eleanor replied, keeping her tone neutral. Jake encouraged him to leave. Samuel's jaw tightened. He didn't. He was unpleasant, but nothing more, Eleanor assured him, though he seemed quite interested in your business affairs. Samuel sat heavily at the table, suddenly looking older than his years. Hartley's been circling like a vulture ever since Sarah died. He knows I'm struggling, knows one bad season could finish me. Now he's probably wondering if taking on a wife will make me stronger or weaker. Eleanor set a plate before him, then surprised herself by sitting down across from him rather than eating standing as she'd been trained to do in service situations. Which will it do, make you stronger or weaker? He looked up at her, those steady brown eyes holding depths she was only beginning to understand. Depends on the wife, I suppose. Someone who needs protecting, who can't handle the hardships that would break me faster than any drought, but someone who could stand beside me, who could help carry the load. Tell me about the mortgage, Eleanor said directly. How bad is it? Samuel hesitated, clearly uncomfortable discussing finances with a woman he'd known less than a day. But something in Eleanor's expression must have convinced him because he began to explain. The numbers were worse than she'd expected, but not impossible. The ranch was profitable, just not profitable enough given the debt from expansion and the losses from the bad winter. How much would it take to get ahead of it? Eleanor asked, her mind already working through possibilities. Not to pay it off entirely, just to get breathing room. $500 would buy us a year, Samuel admitted. 1,000 would secure us properly, but might as well wish for the moon. Eleanor stood abruptly, decision crystallizing. I need to show you something. She went to her room, returning with her valise. From its depths, she pulled out a small leather pouch, heavy with promise. Samuel's eyes widened as she poured its contents onto the table, gold coins and banknotes, more money than he'd probably seen in one place. $643, she said quietly. Everything I had saved, everything I could sell before leaving Boston. I was going to keep it hidden insurance in case this arrangement didn't work. But that's the kind of thinking that belongs to my old life, where everyone had secret escapes planned and no one could be trusted. Samuel stared at the money as if it might disappear. Eleanor, I can't. You can and you will, she interrupted. I'm not giving it to you. I'm investing it in our future. In this ranch, this life we're supposedly building together. Either we're partners or we're not. Either I belong here or I don't. Which is it? The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of the moment. Then Samuel reached across the table, his calloused hand covering hers. Partners, he said firmly, equal partners. Your name goes on the deed alongside mine after we're married. Your money, my land, our ranch. Our ranch, Eleanor repeated, testing the words. They felt right in her mouth, like a promise and a prayer combined. Samuel stood, energy suddenly coursing through him. We'll go to the bank tomorrow, pay down the mortgage, get ahead of Hartley's schemes. And then, he paused, a rare smile lighting his features. Then we'll buy some cattle at the fall auction, good breeding stock. With your head for figures and my knowledge of ranching, we could build something real here. The rest of the day passed in a blur of planning and preparation. Samuel showed her the account books, and Eleanor's teacher-trained mind immediately began spotting patterns and possibilities. She suggested different crop rotations for the hayfields, ways to cut expenses without sacrificing quality, even a plan to sell eggs and vegetables in town for extra income. You've thought about this before, Samuel observed, watching her sketch out planting schedules. I ran a classroom on almost no budget for 3 years, Eleanor replied. You learn to make every penny count, to see opportunities where others see obstacles. This is just a larger classroom with cattle instead of children. That evening after dinner, they sat on the porch watching the sun set behind the mountains. The temperature dropped quickly once the sun disappeared, and Eleanor shivered in her thin shawl. Without word or ceremony, Samuel draped his coat around her shoulders. It smelled of leather and hay and honest work. Tell me about Sarah, Eleanor said suddenly, surprising herself with the request. Samuel was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, she was nothing like you. Small and delicate, afraid of the horses, always cold even in summer. She tried so hard to be a rancher's wife, but it wore her down like water on stone. I think the pneumonia was just the final straw. Her body was already exhausted from trying to be something she wasn't.
Did you love her? I thought I did. We were so young, and getting married was what you did. But looking back, I think I love the idea of her more than the reality. I wanted a partner, and she wanted a protector. We were working at cross purposes from the start. Eleanor pulled his coat tighter around herself. And now I know the difference between wanting someone to save and wanting someone to stand with. Sarah needed me to be her whole world. You need me to be what part of your new world maybe, but not all of it. It was perceptive, cutting straight to a truth Eleanor was only beginning to understand herself. In Boston, she'd been defined entirely by her position, her respectability, her relationship to the school and society. When that crumbled, she'd become nothing. Here she had the chance to be multiple things, rancher wife, partner herself. I need you to be honest, she said, to not protect me from hard truths or shield me from difficulties. I've been wrapped in cotton wool and look where it got me. If I'm going to survive here, I need to be strong. And I can't be strong if you won't let me. Samuel turned to look at her fully, the dying light casting shadows that emphasized the planes of his face. You're already strong, Eleanor. You survived scandal and ruin, traveled 3,000 miles to marry a stranger, and stood up to Thomas Hartley on your second day here. You don't need my permission to be strong. But I need your partnership to be effective, she countered. Your knowledge, your connections, your reputation in the community. I can bring money and education and determination, but without your acceptance, I'm just another outsider trying to impose Eastern ideas on Western land. Then we teach each other, Samuel suggested. You show me your way with numbers and planning, I'll show you how to read the weather and the cattle. You teach me about books and proper grammar. I'll teach you to ride and shoot. Fair trade. More than fair, Eleanor agreed. That night she lay in bed listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch settling into sleep. Horses, nickering coyotes, calling in the distance, the wind singing through the gaps in the walls. Tomorrow they would go to town, face the banker and the gossips, and probably Hartley's allies. Tomorrow the real work would begin. But tonight she felt something she hadn't experienced in months, hope backed by purpose. The money she'd hoarded as escape insurance would instead become foundation stones. The man she'd expected to tolerate would instead become a true partner. The life she'd accepted in desperation might actually become one chosen in freedom. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. Eleanor, Samuel's voice was hesitant. There's something I want to show you. She wrapped her shawl around her nightgown and opened the door. Samuel stood there with a lantern, fully dressed. Can you ride? A little, she admitted. Side saddle in Boston. That won't do out here, but for tonight you can ride with me. There's something you need to see if you're going to be part of this ranch. Curiosity overcoming propriety, Eleanor pulled on her boots and followed him to the barn. He saddled a gentle mare, then lifted Eleanor up before swinging up behind her. His arms came around her to hold the reins, and she was surrounded by his warmth and solid presence. They rode in silence through the darkness, only the lantern providing small circles of light. After about 20 minutes, Samuel stopped at the top of a rise and pointed ahead. Look. Below them, the valley spread out in the moonlight like a silver sea. The creek wound through it, gleaming like a ribbon, and she could see the shadows of cattle grouped near the water. But what took her breath away was the vastness of it, the sheer scope of land that stretched to the mountains. This is all Double H land, Samuel said quietly. Every acre, every stream, every tree. My grandfather claimed it, my father improved it, and I've been trying to hold it. But seeing it like this at night, it doesn't feel like ownership. It feels like stewardship, like I'm just watching over it for whoever comes next. Your children, Eleanor said without thinking, then blushed at the presumption. Our children, Samuel corrected gently. If we're blessed with them. Sons to work the land, daughters to bring new blood and new ideas. A legacy built on more than just survival. Eleanor leaned back slightly, feeling the solid wall of his chest behind her. It's beautiful. Terrifying, but beautiful. Like most things worth having, Samuel agreed. The ranch, the land, this life, it will demand everything you have and then some. But on nights like this, when the world is quiet and the stars are bright, it gives back more than it takes. They stayed there for a long time, looking out over their future domain. Eleanor thought about the schoolroom she'd left behind with its neat rows of desks and smell of chalk dust.
That had been a small, controlled world where she'd felt safe, but ultimately trapped. This was vast and wild and dangerous, but it was also honest in a way Boston had never been. "Are you afraid?" Samuel asked suddenly. "Terrified," Eleanor admitted. "But not of the work or the hardship or even Hartley. I'm afraid of failing you, of not being strong enough or smart enough to help save this place." Samuel's arms tightened slightly around her. "You won't fail. Know how I know." "How?" "Because you admitted you're afraid. Sarah never did, just pretended everything was fine until it wasn't. You tell the truth even when it's uncomfortable. That's worth more than all the courage in the world." On the ride back, Eleanor allowed herself to relax against him, to feel the rhythm of the horse's gait and the steady breathing of the man who would soon be her husband. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was something that might grow into love, given time and trust and shared purpose. When they reached the ranch, Samuel helped her down, his hands lingering on her waist just a moment longer than necessary. "Thank you," he said. "For the money, yes, but more for the partnership, for seeing something here worth fighting for." "Thank you," Eleanor replied, "for seeing something in me worth taking a chance on." They stood there in the barn lantern light, casting golden shadows, the moment stretching between them like a bridge between past and future. Then Samuel stepped back, breaking the spell. "Big day tomorrow. Better get some rest." Eleanor returned to her room, but sleep eluded her for hours. Her mind was too full of plans and possibilities. She thought about the garden, how she could expand it to provide more food and perhaps income. She thought about the house, the improvements that could be made with careful investment. She thought about the ranch hands, wondering if better food and working conditions might improve their loyalty and productivity. But mostly she thought about Samuel Hayes, this quiet man who'd offered her acceptance before attraction partnership, before passion. In Boston, she'd been courted by men who'd written poetry and brought flowers who'd promised her the moon and stars. But when scandal had touched her, they'd vanished like morning mist. Samuel offered her something different, not the moon and stars, but solid ground to stand on. Not poetry, but truth. Not passion, perhaps, but purpose. And maybe given time, something deeper than any of it. The next morning arrived gray and drizzly, unusual for the season. Eleanor dressed carefully in her best remaining dress, a dark blue wool that was respectable without being ostentatious. She pinned her hair severely back, wanting to project competence and reliability to the banker. Samuel appeared in his Sunday suit, looking uncomfortable but determined. "Ready?" "As I'll ever be," Eleanor replied, picking up the pouch of money. The ride to town was quiet, both of them preparing for the battles ahead. The rain had stopped, but clouds still hung low and threatening. As they reached the outskirts of Willow Creek, Eleanor could see curtains, twitching faces appearing at windows. News of her arrival had clearly spread. The bank was a solid brick building that projected permanence and prosperity. Inside it was all dark wood and serious faces designed to intimidate borrowers and reassure depositors. The clerk, a thin man with suspicious eyes, looked them over disapprovingly before fetching the banker. Josiah Winters was everything Eleanor had expected, portly, prosperous, and patronizing. He greeted Samuel with false heartiness and Eleanor with barely concealed dismissal. "Hayes, good to see you. And this must be your intended." "My fiancée, Miss Eleanor Carter," Samuel corrected firmly. "We're here to make a payment on the mortgage." Winter's eyebrows rose. "Indeed, how fortunate. Though I should mention that Mr. Hartley was just here yesterday expressing interest in assuming your debt should you wish to sell." "We don't," Eleanor said clearly before Samuel could respond. "In fact, we're here to pay down the principal significantly." She placed the pouch on the desk with a satisfying thunk. Winter's eyes widened as she counted out $600 in gold and notes. "This should reduce the principal considerably and put us ahead on payments." "Us," Winters questioned. "The mortgage is in Mr. Hayes' name alone." "For now," Samuel interjected. "After our marriage, my wife will be added to all documentation as co-owner. I'll need you to prepare the paperwork." The banker's face went through several interesting color changes. "That's highly irregular. Women don't typically travel 3,000 miles to help save a ranch either," Eleanor interrupted smoothly. "Yet here I am. Now, shall we discuss the new payment schedule, or do we need to take our business to the bank in Cheyenne? The threat was empty. Cheyenne was too far for regular banking, but Winters didn't know that. He grudgingly began preparing receipts and recalculating payments. The new schedule was manageable, even comfortable with room for investment in the ranch's improvement. As they were finishing, the door burst open and Thomas Hartley strode in, followed by his perpetual shadows. His gaze went immediately to the money on the banker's desk, and his face darkened with anger. "Well, well," he said coldly, "the schoolmarm's got hidden depths, or should I say hidden funds. One wonders how a ruined woman comes by so much money." The implication was clear and ugly. Eleanor felt Samuel tense beside her, ready for violence, but she placed a calming hand on his arm. Every penny was honestly earned through 3 years of teaching and careful saving, Mr. Hartley. I have documentation if anyone requires it, though I find it interesting that you're so concerned with my finances, almost as if you had plans that they're disrupting. "You won't last the winter," Hartley said flatly, abandoning pretense. "A city woman playing at ranching a man too stubborn to know when he's beaten. This changes nothing." "It changes everything," Samuel said quietly, but with iron in his voice. "It means we're not desperate anymore. It means we can wait you out, match any move you make. It means you've lost, Hartley, and you know it." For a moment, Eleanor thought Hartley might actually attack them right there in the bank. Then he smiled cold and sharp as a winter wind. "We'll see about that. Winter's coming, and winter has a way of sorting the wheat from the chaff. When you're freezing and starving, when the cattle are dying and the wells are frozen, remember, you could have sold for a fair price." He stalked out, leaving silence in his wake. Winters cleared his throat nervously. "I'll have those deed modifications ready within the week." Outside the bank, Eleanor realized she was shaking. Samuel guided her to the wagon, helping her up with gentle hands. "You were magnificent," he said quietly. "I've never seen anyone handle both Winters and Hartley so well." "I was terrified," Eleanor admitted. "But I learned something in Boston. Bullies are the same everywhere, whether they wear fine suits or rough leather. Show weakness, and they destroy you. Show strength, and they look for easier prey." They stopped at the general store for supplies, and Eleanor got her first real taste of being the center of gossip. Conversation stopped when she entered, then resumed in whispers. The proprietor's wife, Mrs. Patterson, was cordial but cold, clearly reserving judgment. Eleanor selected her purchases carefully, practical items mostly, but also a few small luxuries. Real coffee, white sugar, a bolt of fabric for curtains. Each choice was watched and would be discussed, she knew. She was being tested, measured against some invisible standard of what a rancher's wife should be. Just as they were leaving, a young woman approached hesitantly. She was pretty in a faded way, with work-worn hands and tired eyes. "Miss Carter, I'm Mary Brennan. Our ranch borders yours to the east. I wanted to welcome you." It was brave, Eleanor realized. This woman was risking social censure by publicly acknowledging her. "Thank you, Mrs. Brennan. That's very kind." Mary glanced around nervously, then leaned closer. "Don't let them intimidate you. Half the women in this town have secrets they'd rather forget. You were just unfortunate enough to have yours made public. And Samuel Hayes is a good man who deserves happiness. I hope you can give each other that." Before Eleanor could respond, Mary hurried away. But her words lingered a small kindness in a sea of judgment. The ride home was subdued, both of them processing the morning's events. As they crested the hill that brought the ranch into view, Samuel suddenly stopped the wagon. "What is it?" Eleanor asked, alarmed. Samuel pointed to the house where a figure sat on the porch. Even from a distance, Eleanor could see it was a woman, elderly, dressed in black. "My mother," Samuel said, and Eleanor heard years of complicated history in those 2 words. The woman stood as they approached ramrod straight, despite her obvious age. She had Samuel's strong features softened but not weakened by time. Her eyes were sharp as she studied Eleanor, taking in every detail from her muddy boots to her determined chin. "Mother," Samuel said carefully, "I didn't expect you." "Clearly?" Margaret Hayes replied, her voice carrying the authority of someone used to being obeyed. "I heard you'd taken a mail-order bride. I had to see what kind of woman would marry my son sight unseen."
Eleanor climbed down from the wagon without waiting for help meeting the older woman's gaze directly. A desperate one, she said honestly, but also a determined one. I'm Eleanor Carter. Margaret's eyebrows rose at the directness. Well, at least you don't simper. Come inside, both of you. We need to talk. The kitchen felt smaller with Margaret Hayes in it. She commanded space the way some people commanded attention through sheer force of personality. Eleanor made tea while Samuel explained recent events, including the mortgage payment and Hartley's threats. You used your savings, Margaret asked Eleanor directly. I invested them, Eleanor corrected, in a future that seemed worth the risk. Margaret studied her for a long moment. Sarah would never have done that. She would have kept that money hidden an escape route for when things got hard. You're either very brave or very foolish. Probably both, Eleanor admitted. But I've learned that safety is an illusion. The most respectable position, the most careful plans, they can all crumble in an instant. So why not risk everything on something real? Margaret's stern expression softened slightly. You remind me of myself at your age. I came west as a new bride too, though I at least knew the man I was marrying. Lost everything in a fire our second year, had to rebuild from nothing. It either makes you or breaks you, this land. Then I guess we'll find out which I am, Eleanor said simply. Margaret stayed for dinner, and Eleanor was grateful for the older woman's presence as a buffer. She told stories of the ranch's early days of Samuel as a boy, of the challenges and triumphs that had shaped this land. But underneath the reminiscence was assessment, and Eleanor knew she was still being tested. As darkness fell, Margaret prepared to leave. She lived in town now in a small house Samuel had bought her after his father died. At the door, she turned to Eleanor. You'll do, she said simply. You're not what I would have chosen, but then Sarah was exactly what I would have chosen, and look how that ended. Sometimes what we need isn't what we expect. After she left, Samuel and Eleanor stood awkwardly in the kitchen. The day had been exhausting emotional, and Eleanor felt raw from being constantly evaluated. She liked you, Samuel said, sounding surprised. How could you tell? She didn't offer to pray for your soul or suggest you might be happier elsewhere. For my mother, that's practically an endorsement. Despite everything, Eleanor laughed. The bar for acceptance is set pretty low around here. Samuel moved closer, not quite touching, but near enough that she could feel his warmth. Eleanor, about the wedding, we could wait if you need more time. After today, after seeing what you're really signing up for. No, Eleanor interrupted. If anything today made me more certain, I know what I'm fighting now, who the enemies are, what the stakes involve. I'd rather face it as your wife than as your fiancée. Wives have legal standing, social position, harder to dismiss or intimidate. That's a practical reason for marriage, Samuel observed. Most women want something more romantic. Eleanor looked up at him, this steady, solid man who'd offered her partnership before passion. Romance is for people who have the luxury of choice, Samuel. We're building something more practical, but maybe also more lasting. Romance can fade, but respect, trust, shared purpose. Those can grow stronger with time. He reached out, tucking a strand of her hair behind her ear. It was the first time he'd touched her with intent rather than necessity, and Eleanor felt it like lightning down her spine. You're right, but Eleanor, that doesn't mean there can't be affection too. Even love eventually if we're lucky. If we're lucky, she agreed softly. They stood there caught in a moment of possibility until Jake's voice from outside broke the spell. Something about a fence down and cattle straying. Samuel sighed, duty calling, but before he left he squeezed Eleanor's hand. Friday, he asked, for the wedding. Friday, she confirmed. Alone again, Eleanor began planning. There was so much to do, the house to prepare, a dress to alter, food to plan for whatever celebration might follow. But also bigger things. How to strengthen the ranch's defenses against Hartley. How to build alliances with the other ranchers. How to transform from Eleanor Carter, disgraced schoolteacher, into Eleanor Hayes. Rancher's wife and partner. The wind picked up outside, rattling the windows, and Eleanor thought she could smell snow on the air. Winter was indeed coming, just as Hartley had threatened. But she'd survived the winter of her disgrace, the cold shoulders and colder hearts of Boston society. She could survive this too, and more, she could thrive. The days leading to Friday passed in a whirlwind of preparation and unexpected challenges.
Eleanor threw herself into transforming the house, not dramatically, but in small ways that made it feel less like a memorial and more like a home ready for new memories. She hung the curtains she'd sewn from the fabric bought in town, their cheerful blue bringing warmth to the stark windows. The tablecloth she fashioned from an old sheet found in the linen closet made the rough dining table look almost elegant. But it was Thursday morning when everything nearly fell apart. Eleanor woke to the sound of shouting and the thunder of hooves. Through her window, she could see riders circling the cattle pen, whooping and firing guns into the air. The cattle, already nervous from the coming storm, stampeded against the fence posts, and she heard the crack of wood giving way. She dressed hastily and ran outside to find chaos. Samuel and Jake were trying to calm the spooked cattle while two ranch hands attempted to corner the riders. But they were outnumbered, and the strangers seemed intent on causing maximum damage. Without thinking, Eleanor ran to the barn where she'd seen Samuel store his rifles. The Winchester was heavier than she'd expected, and she'd only fired a gun twice in her life during a brief lesson from her father years ago. But desperation made her bold. She stepped onto the porch, raised the rifle, and fired into the air. The sound cracked like thunder, loud enough to momentarily freeze everyone. The riders wheeled their horses to face her, and she recognized one of them, Hartley's foreman, a cruel-faced man named Dixon. "Next one goes through you," Eleanor called out, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "You're trespassing on Double H land and destroying private property. That's a hanging offense in Wyoming territory." Dixon laughed ugly and dismissive. "You won't shoot. Eastern ladies don't have the stomach for violence." Eleanor lowered the rifle slightly and put a bullet into the ground 6 inches from his horse's front hooves. The animal reared, nearly throwing him. "Eastern ladies also don't usually marry ranchers and fight for their land," she said coolly. "Want to test what else I might do?" For a moment, the standoff held tension, crackling like the electricity in the storm-heavy air. Then Samuel appeared at her side, his own rifle trained on Dixon. "You heard my wife. Get off our land." "She ain't your wife yet." Dixon sneered, but he was already backing his horse away. "Close enough," Samuel replied. "And if any of Hartley's men come near our property again, we'll settle this permanent-like. Tell your boss that." The riders galloped off, but the damage was done. 3 fence posts were broken, and the cattle were scattered, some having broken through into the pasture beyond. It would take all day to round them up and repair the fence work that should have been spent preparing for tomorrow's wedding. Eleanor set down the rifle, her hands suddenly shaking. Samuel caught her shoulders, steadying her. "That was incredible," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "You probably saved the herd." "I could have gotten someone killed," Eleanor replied, the reality of what she'd done hitting her. "I don't even know how to properly shoot." "Then we'll teach you," Jake said, appearing with the other hands. "Any woman brave enough to face down Dixon deserves to know how to defend herself proper." The rest of the day was spent in hard labor. Eleanor worked alongside the men, learning to string barbed wire and hammer posts. Her hands blistered and bled, her dress tore on the wire, and by evening she was exhausted, filthy, and exhilarated. This was real work with visible results so different from the abstract challenges of teaching. Mary Brennan arrived as the sun was setting, bringing a covered dish and unexpected support. "Heard about this morning?" she said simply. "Figured you could use some help for tomorrow." Behind her came 2 other women, Mrs. Chen, the Chinese laundress, whose husband ran the town's restaurant, and surprisingly, Mrs. Morrison, Jake's wife, whom Eleanor hadn't even known existed. "Jake doesn't like me coming to the ranch much," Mrs. Morrison explained, a sturdy woman with kind eyes. "Says it's too dangerous, but for a wedding exceptions must be made." The women took over shooing the men out while they transformed the main room into something resembling a wedding venue. Mrs. Chen had brought white paper lanterns from her husband's restaurant, delicate things that caught the lamplight like captured stars. Mary had gathered wildflowers and sage, weaving them into garlands. Mrs. Morrison had somehow procured white ribbon, probably worth its weight in gold out here. "Why are you doing this?" Eleanor asked, overwhelmed by their kindness. "You don't even know me." Mary and Mrs. Morrison exchanged glances, but it was Mrs. Chen who answered in her careful English. "We know what it is to be outsider, to have people look and whisper and judge. You stand up to Dixon this morning, that take courage. Courage deserve respect." As they worked, the women shared their own stories.
Mary had come west as a mail-order bride herself 5 years ago. Mrs. Morrison had been a saloon girl before Jake married her, a past that still made respectable women cross the street to avoid her. Mrs. Chen faced daily prejudice for her race, her husband's successful business, making them targets of resentment. "We're all outcasts in our way," Mary said quietly. "But out here that matters less than what you do with your life. Samuel Hayes is lucky to have a woman who will fight for him and his ranch. Don't let anyone tell you different." They worked late into the night, and when they finally left, the house looked transformed. It was still simple, still rough around the edges, but there was beauty in it now, intention and care. Eleanor stood in the doorway watching them go, tears pricking her eyes at the unexpected solidarity. Samuel appeared beside her, cleaned up from the day's work. "It looks wonderful," he said softly. "Like a real wedding." "Is that what you want?" Eleanor asked. "A real wedding? Or are we just making this arrangement legal?" He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he turned to face her fully, his hands coming up to frame her face. "Eleanor, when I sent for a mail-order bride, I expected a business arrangement, someone to cook and clean and maybe give me children. I didn't expect you fierce and brave and so damn strong it takes my breath away. I didn't expect to feel—" He trailed off, but his thumb brushed her cheekbone with infinite gentleness. "Tomorrow, when I make those vows, I'll mean them, every word. This might have started as convenience, but it's becoming something more, at least for me." Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs. "For me too," she whispered. "I came here running from my past, but somewhere in the last week I started running toward something instead. Toward you, toward this life, toward a future I actually want rather than one I'm settling for." Samuel leaned down, and Eleanor thought he might kiss her. But thunder cracked overhead and the moment broke. The storm that had been threatening all day finally arrived, rain hammering the roof like angry fists. "I should go," Samuel said reluctantly. "Dawn comes early, and tomorrow we get married." Eleanor finished the words feeling surreal and solid at once. He squeezed her hands once and disappeared into the storm, heading for his makeshift quarters in the barn. Eleanor stood listening to the rain, thinking about tomorrow, about the vows she would make. In Boston, she'd dreamed of a grand wedding at Trinity Church, with hundreds of guests and a reception at the Parker House. Instead, she'd have a simple ceremony in a frontier church with a handful of witnesses, half of them social outcasts like herself. Yet she wouldn't trade it. That grand wedding would have been for show, the marriage itself probably equally superficial. This was real, built on truth and necessity and growing affection. It wasn't the fairy tale she'd imagined as a girl, but it was honest, and that was worth more. Friday dawned clear and cold, the storm having washed the air clean. Eleanor woke early nerves and excitement, making sleep impossible. She heated water for a proper bath, a luxury she'd been saving for this day. As she washed her hair with the last of her rose-scented soap from Boston, she thought about transformation, about the woman she'd been and the woman she was becoming. Mary Brennan arrived as she was struggling with her hair, trying to create something elegant from its unruly waves. "Let me," Mary said simply, and with practiced hands created a style that was both practical and pretty, with small braids worked through like a crown. The dress was another challenge. Eleanor had only one good dress left, the blue wool she'd worn to the bank. But Mrs. Chen had worked magic with some of the white ribbon, creating a collar and cuffs that transformed it into something almost bridal. Mrs. Morrison contributed a cameo brooch that had been her mother's, and Mary offered a pair of delicate white gloves she'd been saving for something special. "Something old, something new, something borrowed, something blue," Mrs. Morrison said with satisfaction. "You're all set." When Eleanor emerged from the bedroom, she found the main room full of people. Jake and the ranch hands were there in their cleanest clothes. Margaret Hayes sat in the best chair, her stern face showing what might have been approval. Even some of the neighboring ranchers had come, drawn by curiosity, or perhaps genuine goodwill. But Eleanor only had eyes for Samuel. He stood by the window in his dark suit, the morning light highlighting the silver threads in his dark hair. When he turned to see her, his expression made her heart stop. It was wonder and want, and something deeper, something that might grow into love, given time and trust. "Beautiful,"
he said simply. But the word carried weight, meant more than just her appearance. It meant her courage, her strength, her willingness to stand beside him against whatever came. The ride to church was a procession, wagons and horses creating a parade through town. Eleanor knew people were watching from windows and doorways, knew this would be gossiped about for months. The disgraced schoolteacher from Boston marrying the stubborn rancher, both of them defying Thomas Hartley, both of them refusing to bend to the town's expectations. Let them talk, she thought. They'd been talking about her since she arrived. At least now they'd have something true to discuss. The church was small and white, exactly as she'd pictured a frontier church should be. Reverend Phillips was young and nervous, probably performing only his second or third wedding. But his words were sincere as he spoke about partnership and perseverance, about building something lasting in a world that often seemed temporary. When it came time for the vows, Samuel took her hands in his. His voice was steady and sure as he promised to love, honor, and cherish. But then he went off script, adding his own words. Eleanor, you came to me as a stranger, but you've become my partner. You've shown more courage in a week than most people show in a lifetime. I promise not just to protect you, but to stand beside you. Not just to provide for you, but to build with you. Not just to honor you as my wife, but to respect you as my equal. This ranch, this life, this future, it's ours to make or break together. Eleanor's eyes burned with unshed tears. When her turn came, she found herself adding her own promises too. Samuel, you offered me shelter when I needed it, but more than that, you offered me truth. You saw me at my lowest and didn't turn away. I promised to match your honesty with my own, your strength with determination, your dreams with practical action. I came here with nothing but hope. I stand here with everything I need, a partner, a purpose, and a place to belong. The kiss that sealed their union was gentle, almost hesitant, as if they were both aware of the crowd watching. But there was promise in it, too, of deeper intimacy to come when they were alone. The celebration afterward was held at the ranch, people spilling out onto the porch and into the yard. Mrs. Chen's husband had brought food from his restaurant dishes that mixed Chinese and American flavors in ways that had people coming back for seconds. Someone had brought a fiddle, and impromptu dancing broke out, couples swirling in the dust while children ran between their legs. Eleanor found herself pulled into dance after dance, neighboring ranchers apparently deciding that marriage made her acceptable enough for social interaction. She caught glimpses of Samuel throughout, always surrounded by men discussing cattle prices and weather predictions, but his eyes would find hers across the crowd, and each look felt like a touch. Thomas Hartley made his appearance as the sun was setting, riding up with his usual contingent of men. The music stopped, conversations died, and tension crackled through the air like the yesterday's storm. Came to offer my congratulations, he said, his voice carrying clearly across the yard. And to make one final offer. I'll buy the double H for twice what I offered before. You can take your new wife and start fresh somewhere else, somewhere her past won't follow her. The threat was subtle but clear. He knew about Boston, about the scandal, and he'd use it if necessary. Eleanor felt the crowd's eyes on her, some sympathetic, others eager for drama. This was the test, she realized. Not the wedding, but this moment when she had to choose between running again or standing her ground. She stepped forward before Samuel could respond, moving with the same determined grace she'd used to face down Dixon. Mr. Hartley, how kind of you to be concerned about my past. But you see, I've already told my husband everything. About Boston, about the false accusations, about the powerful men who thought they could destroy me because I refused to be what they wanted. She paused, letting her words sink in. The difference between you and them is that they succeeded in driving me away. You won't. This is my home now, my land, my life. And if you think you can frighten me with whispers and rumors, you clearly haven't been paying attention. I've already survived my reputation being destroyed. What else could you possibly threaten me with? Hartley's face darkened with rage. You'll regret this, both of you. When winter comes, we'll survive it. Samuel interrupted, moving to stand beside Eleanor. Like we survived your harassment, your attempts at sabotage, your constant pressure. We're not alone anymore, Hartley. We have each other, and we have the support of our neighbors. Your time of bullying this valley is over. For a moment, violence hung in the air like smoke. Then Jake and the ranch hand stepped forward, followed by several of the neighboring ranchers. Even old Mr. Patterson from the general store moved to stand with them. The message was clear: the community was choosing sides, and they were choosing the Hayes Ranch. Hartley wheeled his horse around without another word, his men following. As they galloped away, the tension broke like a fever, and suddenly everyone was talking at once, laughing with relief and triumph. "That was the bravest thing I've ever seen," Mary Brennan said, hugging Eleanor tightly. "You faced him down like you were born to it." But Eleanor was shaking now, adrenaline leaving her weak. Samuel's arm came around her waist, solid and supporting. "Let's get you inside," he murmured. "You've done enough fighting for one day." The party continued outside, but Eleanor found herself in the quiet of the kitchen with Samuel, Margaret, and Jake. Margaret poured whiskey for all of them, even Eleanor, who rarely drank spirits. "You did good, girl," Margaret said, and coming from her it was the highest praise. "Sarah would have fainted or cried. You stood up and fought back. That's what this land needs, women who are partners, not passengers." "Hartley won't give up," Jake warned. "He's too invested now, spent too much time and effort trying to break us. He'll try something else." "Let him try," Samuel said quietly. "We've got the mortgage secured, the cattle are healthy, and now we've got the community on our side. Whatever he throws at us, we'll handle." As the evening wore on, guests gradually departed, offering congratulations and promises of support. The women who'd helped with preparations cleaned up with quiet efficiency, refusing Eleanor's attempts to help. "It's your wedding night," Mrs. Morrison said with a knowing smile. "You have other duties to attend to." Eleanor blushed furiously, suddenly aware that soon she'd be alone with Samuel, truly alone as his wife. The thought was thrilling and terrifying in equal measure. Finally, the last guest left, and even Jake retreated to the bunkhouse with obvious reluctance to leave them unguarded. Eleanor stood in the main room now, restored to its normal state, uncertain what came next. Samuel appeared in the doorway to what had been his bedroom, now theirs. "I know this isn't what you might have expected for a wedding night," he said awkwardly. "If you need time, if you want to wait." Eleanor crossed to him, placing her hand on his chest, feeling his heart racing under her palm. "Samuel, I've spent my whole life doing what was expected, what was proper, what was safe. Look where it got me. I don't want to wait anymore. I want to start our life together, really together tonight." His hands came up to cradle her face, and this time with no storm or audience to interrupt, he kissed her properly. It wasn't the practiced seduction of the Boston men who'd courted her, all technique and no feeling. It was honest and hungry and a little clumsy, and Eleanor felt it down to her toes. "I'll be gentle," he promised against her lips. "I'm not fragile," she replied, echoing their first conversation. "I won't break." What followed was a discovery of each other, tentative at first, then with growing confidence. Samuel was indeed gentle, but Eleanor found strength she didn't know she possessed, passion she'd never been allowed to express in her proper Boston life. When they finally lay quiet in the darkness, wrapped around each other like they'd been doing this for years instead of hours, Eleanor felt fundamentally changed. "No regrets?" Samuel asked, his voice rough with emotion. "None," Eleanor replied firmly. "For the first time in my life, I'm exactly where I want to be." Outside, a wolf howled in the distance, answered by another, then another. The sound should have been frightening, but instead it felt like a celebration, like the wild itself was acknowledging their union. Eleanor pressed closer to Samuel's warmth, feeling his arms tighten around her protectively. "Tell me about winter," she said quietly. "What should I expect?" Samuel was quiet for a moment, considering. "It'll be hard. Harder than anything you've experienced. The cold gets into your bones, makes everything twice as difficult. The cattle need constant tending, ice broken on water troughs, extra feed hauled out. We might get snowed in for weeks at a time, just us and whatever supplies we've stored. Some winters we lose cattle to cold or wolves or disease. And Hartley's right that it tests everything, your strength, your resolve, your partnerships." "But we'll survive it," Eleanor said, not a question but a statement. "We'll survive it," Samuel agreed. "And come spring, we'll be stronger for it. That's how the frontier works. It breaks the weak, but forges the strong into something unbreakable." They talked quietly through the night, sharing stories and plans and fears. Samuel told her about his first winter on the ranch alone after his father's death, learning through trial and error how to keep the cattle alive.
Eleanor shared memories of Boston winters so different from what she'd face here, all social obligations and careful navigation of icy sidewalks in inappropriate shoes. "I'll need proper boots," she said practically, "and warmer clothes. These Eastern fashions won't survive a Wyoming winter." "We'll go to town next week," Samuel promised. "Get you outfitted properly, and Eleanor, don't let the other women make you feel bad for wearing practical clothes. You're a rancher's wife now, not a decorative ornament." "Partner," she corrected. "You said partner, not just wife." "Partner." He agreed, sealing it with a kiss. As dawn approached, neither had slept, but neither seemed tired. There was too much to process, too much to plan, too much to discover about each other. When the first light painted the mountains pink and gold, just as Samuel had promised, that first day they stood at the window watching the world wake up. "It's beautiful," Eleanor breathed, seeing the familiar view with new eyes. "It's ours," Samuel corrected. "Whatever comes Hartley winter, whatever challenges we face them together now." The sound of Jake starting work in the barn reached them the normal day beginning despite the momentous change in their lives. Eleanor thought about getting dressed, starting breakfast, beginning her first full day as Mrs. Samuel Hayes. But Samuel pulled her back to bed, murmuring something about Jake being able to manage alone for once. As she settled back into his arms, Eleanor thought about the woman who'd stepped off that stagecoach just a week ago. That woman had been running from disgrace, seeking any shelter from the storm of scandal. She'd been prepared to accept a loveless marriage as the price of survival. Instead, she'd found something she hadn't dared hope for: a true partnership, the beginning of real affection, and a purpose worth fighting for. The scandal that had driven her from Boston seemed insignificant now, the opinions of those small-minded people irrelevant. They'd tried to destroy her by taking away her respectability, not understanding that respectability was a cage as much as a shield. Here, she didn't need to be respectable. She needed to be strong, honest, brave, and capable. She needed to be a partner worthy of the man beside her and the land they'd protect together. It would be hard, she had no illusions about that. Winter would test them, Hartley would scheme against them, and the 1,000 challenges of frontier life would demand everything she had to give. But she'd give it gladly. Because for the first time in her life, Eleanor wasn't living according to someone else's rules or expectations. She was writing her own story, choosing her own path, building her own future. And that freedom, hard-won and precious, was worth any price she might have to pay. The first snows came earlier than expected, just 2 weeks after the wedding. Eleanor woke to a world transformed, white and pristine and utterly silent. She stood at the window in her nightgown, mesmerized by the way the snow had softened every harsh edge of the landscape, making even the rough barn look like something from a fairy tale. "First snow's always pretty," Samuel said from behind her, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. "It's the 10th or 20th that starts to wear on you." But Eleanor couldn't shake her wonder, even as she quickly learned what snow meant for ranch work. The cattle needed to be moved to sheltered areas, hay had to be distributed twice daily instead of once, and ice had to be broken on water troughs every few hours. She threw herself into the work with determination, ignoring the way her hands cracked and bled from the cold, the way her back ached from hauling feed. 3 days into the snow, they had unexpected visitors. A wagon struggled up the road, and Eleanor recognized the Brennans, Mary, her husband Tom, and their 3 children. But something was wrong. Tom was slumped against Mary, his face gray with pain, and blood stained the blanket wrapped around him. "Hartley's men," Mary gasped as Samuel helped carry Tom inside. "They said we were grazing on Triple Bar land. Tom tried to explain we weren't, and they shot him." Eleanor immediately took charge, her teaching experience having included basic medical training. The bullet had passed through Tom's shoulder, missing anything vital but leaving damage that needed careful tending. While she cleaned and bandaged the wound, Samuel and Jake rode out to verify Mary's story, finding clear evidence that Hartley's men had moved the boundary markers to make it appear the Brennans were trespassing. "He's escalating," Jake said grimly when they returned, "testing how far he can push before someone pushes back." That night, as the Brennans slept in the main room and Tom's fever finally broke, Samuel made a decision. "We're going to the sheriff in Cheyenne. This has to be documented official." "The sheriff won't care about homesteaders' complaints against Thomas Hartley," Eleanor pointed out practically.
He's too powerful, contributes too much to political campaigns. Then we make it impossible to ignore, Samuel replied. We get sworn statements from everyone Hartley's harassed. We document every moved marker, every damaged fence, every threat. We build a case so solid that even a bought sheriff has to act. It took a week to gather everything, Eleanor carefully transcribing testimonies in her neat teacher's handwriting while Samuel rode from ranch to ranch collecting evidence. What emerged was a pattern of systematic intimidation that went back years, always just shy of what could be prosecuted, always targeting those too weak or isolated to fight back. The trip to Cheyenne meant leaving the ranch in Jake's capable hands and traveling through increasingly heavy snow. They stayed one night in a boarding house, and Eleanor saw how other travelers looked at them, a mismatched couple, the refined Eastern woman and the weathered rancher. But she felt none of the shame she might have once experienced. Let them look. They didn't know what she and Samuel were building together. Sheriff Morrison, no relation to Jake, was exactly what they'd expected. Prosperous, political, and clearly uninterested in pursuing complaints against his wealthy supporter. But Eleanor had come prepared for this too. She'd spent her last days in Boston learning how the law worked, knowing she might need legal knowledge to protect herself. The Homestead Act of 1862, she said calmly, producing a copy she'd procured from the land office. Section 7 specifically prohibits the harassment of legal homesteaders and provides federal penalties for those who attempt to drive settlers from legally claimed land through violence or intimidation. What Mr. Hartley is doing isn't just a local crime, it's a federal offense. The sheriff's expression changed, calculation replacing dismissal. Federal marshals were a different breed from local law enforcement, less susceptible to bribes and local pressure. If this became a federal case, his own position might be scrutinized. I'll look into it, he said finally, and while it wasn't the immediate action they'd hoped for, it was more than they'd expected. On the ride home, the weather turned vicious. What had been steady snow became a blizzard wind driving ice crystals that cut like glass. They were still 10 miles from the ranch when visibility dropped to nothing, the horses struggling through drifts that grew deeper by the minute. "We need shelter," Samuel shouted over the wind. "There's a line shack about a mile north. We can wait out the worst of it there." Eleanor could barely feel her hands or feet by the time they reached the tiny cabin. It was meant for cowboys working far from the main ranch, just one room with a stove, a narrow bed, and basic supplies. Samuel immediately set about starting a fire while Eleanor stamped feeling back into her numb extremities. "This is what winter means out here," Samuel said once they were warm enough to speak without teeth chattering. "Death waiting in every storm, always ready to claim the careless or unlucky." But Eleanor wasn't frightened. Instead, she felt exhilarated by their survival, by the way they'd worked together without need for words, each knowing what the other needed. "We made it," she said simply. "Together, we made it." They spent 2 days in that tiny cabin waiting for the storm to pass. It should have been miserable. No privacy, limited food, nothing to do but tend the fire and watch the snow fall. Instead, it became a honeymoon of sorts. The forced intimacy, allowing them to learn each other in ways the busy ranch life hadn't permitted. Samuel taught her card games his father had learned in the cavalry. Eleanor told him stories from books she'd read, bringing literature alive in ways that made him understand why she'd loved teaching. They made love on the narrow bed, laughing when they nearly fell off, finding joy in the simple pleasure of being young and alive and together. "I love you," Samuel said on the second night, the words emerging as naturally as breath. "I didn't think I could after Sarah. But you're nothing like her, nothing like anyone I've ever known. You make me want to be better, stronger, worthy of the partnership you're offering." Eleanor traced the scar on his chest, a reminder of some long-ago accident he'd told her about. "I love you too. Not because you saved me from scandal or gave me a home, but because you see me, really see me, and still want me beside you." When the storm finally passed, they emerged to a world transformed. Drifts reached the roof of the cabin in places, and it took hours to dig out the horses and make a path home. But the struggle felt like accomplishment rather than hardship. Each conquered drift proof of their capability. The ranch, when they finally reached it, was in crisis. The storm had collapsed part of the barn roof, and they'd lost 6 cattle to the cold. Jake and the hands had worked without rest to save the rest, but exhaustion showed in every movement.
Eleanor immediately took charge of the domestic side, preparing huge quantities of hot food and coffee, while Samuel joined the repair efforts. She worked through the night beside Mary Brennan, who'd stayed to help keeping the men fed and warm as they battled to save the ranch's livelihood. It was dawn before the immediate crisis passed. The barn was patched, if not properly repaired. The surviving cattle were sheltered and fed, and everyone was accounted for. Eleanor stood in the kitchen, swaying with exhaustion when Margaret Hayes arrived on horseback, having ridden from town despite the dangerous conditions. "Heard you were in trouble," she said, simply dismounting with difficulty through the deep snow. "Brought what supplies I could and rounded up some neighbors. They're coming behind with more." Throughout the day, wagons and riders arrived. The Chens brought hot food from their restaurant. The Pattersons contributed lumber for repairs. Even families that had been cool toward Eleanor came recognizing that frontier survival required community support, regardless of personal feelings. But it was the last arrival that surprised everyone. Judge William Foster from Cheyenne appeared with 2 federal marshals, their horses fresh, having clearly pushed hard through difficult conditions. "Mrs. Hayes," the judge said, touching his hat, "your documentation of systematic harassment was very thorough. We've come to investigate, and I understand the primary victim of the most recent violence is here. Tom Brennan, still weak but recovering, gave his testimony." Others followed, emboldened by the presence of federal authority. By evening, the marshals had enough evidence to act. They rode to the Triple Bar, returning hours later with Thomas Hartley in custody. "He'll make bail," Judge Foster warned. "Men like him always do, but he'll stand trial, and the evidence is strong. More importantly, he knows now that his actions have federal attention. That should curb his enthusiasm for harassment." The community celebrated that night, gathering in the repaired barn for an impromptu party. Someone produced a fiddle, someone else contributed whiskey, and soon there was dancing and laughter, the successful confrontation of shared danger, creating bonds that transcended old prejudices. Eleanor found herself accepted in a way she hadn't been before. She'd proven herself through action, standing up to threats, working beside them in crisis, using her education to protect them all. The whispers about her past hadn't stopped, but they'd been superseded by respect for her present. "You did this," Samuel said, pulling her aside from the celebration. "Your courage in facing Hartley, your knowledge of the law, your determination to document everything you saved us all." "We did this," Eleanor corrected. "I couldn't have done any of it without your support, without knowing you'd stand beside me no matter what." As winter deepened, life settled into a rhythm. Hard work during the day, Eleanor learned to milk cows, mend harnesses, even help with birthing calves. Quiet evenings by the fire, Samuel reading while she sewed, or both of them working on plans for spring improvements. Nights of growing intimacy, learning each other's bodies and hearts with patient exploration. The trial happened in February. Hartley's expensive lawyers fought hard, but the evidence was overwhelming. He was convicted of harassment and intimidation, fined heavily, and warned that any further incidents would result in imprisonment. He returned to the Triple Bar, diminished his power, broken by the community's united stand and Eleanor's careful legal strategy. "He'll sell out within a year," Jake predicted, and he was right. By the following Christmas, the Triple Bar was under new ownership, a collective purchase by several smaller ranchers, ensuring no single person could again dominate the valley. But before that resolution, there were more challenges. A late blizzard in March that caught them with depleted hay stores. A disease that swept through the chicken coop Eleanor had established, killing half their birds. A fire in the kitchen that might have destroyed the house if Samuel hadn't smelled smoke and acted quickly. Each crisis tested them, but also strengthened them. They learned to move together like dancers, anticipating each other's needs and compensating for each other's weaknesses. Eleanor's education proved invaluable. She kept meticulous books that revealed waste and opportunities, wrote letters that opened new markets for their beef, even started a small school for the local children that brought in extra income. Samuel's knowledge of the land saved them repeatedly. He could read weather in the set of clouds, predict where to find stranded cattle by understanding their behavior, stretch resources through careful management. But more than practical skills, he provided the steady strength Eleanor leaned on when exhaustion or doubt threatened to overwhelm her. The anniversary of Sarah's death came in April, just as the first wildflowers were beginning to bloom.
Eleanor found Samuel at her grave, a small plot on a hill overlooking the valley. She almost turned away, not wanting to intrude, but he sensed her presence and held out his hand. "I was thanking her," he said quietly, "for teaching me what I didn't want so I could recognize what I did want when you arrived." Eleanor knelt beside him, placing wildflowers on the grave. She was young and frightened and doing her best. We should remember her kindly. "You're generous, so," Samuel observed. "No, just practical. Resenting the dead serves no purpose. And without her, without my scandal, without all the pain that brought us here, we wouldn't have found each other. I can't regret the path when I'm so grateful for the destination." Spring brought its own demands. Calving season meant round-the-clock vigilance, and Eleanor learned to assist with difficult births. Her smaller hands sometimes able to help where Samuel's couldn't. She planted an expanded garden using knowledge gained from the Chen family about crops that would thrive in the harsh climate. She organized the ranch wives into a cooperative, sharing resources and labor in ways that benefited everyone. It was May when she realized she was pregnant. The knowledge came with the morning sickness that sent her running from the breakfast table, Samuel following with concern that turned to wonder when she explained. "A baby," he said, his hand hovering over her still flat stomach as if afraid to touch. "Our baby." "Due in December, I think," Eleanor said, having done the calculations. "A winter child, which seems appropriate given everything." The pregnancy changed things, adding urgency to their preparations. The house needed expansion. They couldn't raise a child in one bedroom. The ranch needed to be more profitable. Children were expensive even on the frontier, and Eleanor needed to train someone to help with her duties when she was confined. Mary Brennan's oldest daughter, Anne, proved perfect. At 15, she was eager to escape the isolation of her family's smaller ranch, and she had a quick mind that absorbed Eleanor's lessons about household management and basic medical care. In exchange, Eleanor taught her reading and arithmetic beyond what the sporadic local school had provided. Summer brought unexpected prosperity. The cattle prices rose sharply due to increased demand from the growing cities back east. The expanded garden produced enough vegetables to sell in town, with Mrs. Chen's restaurant becoming a regular customer. The school Eleanor ran brought in small but steady fees from grateful parents. They paid off the mortgage completely in July, burning the papers in a ceremonial fire that had Eleanor crying tears of joy and relief. The ranch was theirs completely and legally, with her name on the deed alongside Samuel's as promised. "We did it," Samuel said, holding her as they watched the mortgage papers turn to ash. "We're free." But freedom, Eleanor had learned, was never absolute on the frontier. There were always new challenges, new threats, new mountains to climb. August brought drought requiring careful water management and constant vigilance against fire. September saw an early frost that damaged part of the garden, teaching Eleanor about the importance of preservation and storage. Through it all, her pregnancy progressed. Her body changed in ways that amazed and sometimes frightened her. The baby's movements when they started were like butterfly wings at first, then stronger, more insistent, as if the child was already eager to join the world it would inherit. The ranch hands treated her with touching protectiveness, always finding reasons she should sit down, rest, let them handle the heavier work. Jake's gruff concern manifested in him constantly checking that she was eating enough, drinking enough water, not overexerting herself. "You're carrying the future of this ranch," he said once, then blushed furiously at the sentimentality of it. But Eleanor understood. This child would be the firstborn to the new Double H, the partnership ranch, rather than the struggling legacy Samuel had inherited. It represented hope and continuity and proof that life could flourish even in the harshest conditions. October brought the fall gathering when all the ranchers worked together to round up and sort cattle for market. Eleanor, now obviously pregnant, couldn't ride, but she could organize. She coordinated food for the dozens of workers, managed supplies, and kept track of the complex tallies of cattle ownership. It was during the gathering that Thomas Hartley made his final appearance. He came to the camp not with threats or bravado, but as a broken man. The trial, the fines, the loss of community support had destroyed him. He was selling the triple bar and leaving Wyoming territory entirely. "You won," he said to Eleanor, his voice bitter, but somehow also resigned. "A schoolteacher from Boston destroyed everything I built." "No," Eleanor replied, one hand resting on her pregnant belly. You destroyed yourself with greed and cruelty. I just refuse to be another of your victims. After he left, Samuel found her standing alone, looking out over the valley. Any regrets? He asked, echoing their wedding night conversation. None, Eleanor said firmly. He chose his path. We chose ours. The first snow fell early that year in late October, but Eleanor was prepared. The house was warm and well stocked. The cattle were positioned for winter feeding. The barn was reinforced against storms. She'd made clothes for the baby from fabric bought with their new prosperity. Tiny things that seemed impossible for an actual human to wear. November brought Margaret Hayes to stay, the older woman moving in to help with the coming birth. Her presence was both comforting and challenging. She had opinions about everything from cooking to child rearing, but she also had experience Eleanor desperately needed. You're stronger than Sarah was, Margaret said one evening, knitting by the fire while Eleanor worked on the ranch books. She would have been terrified of childbirth. You're just impatient for it to be over so you can meet your child. It was true. Eleanor wasn't afraid of the pain or danger of childbirth. She'd faced down gunmen and blizzards, scandal, and poverty. What was childbirth compared to that? But another challenge to overcome. Another test to pass. The pain started on December 3rd during another snowstorm, because apparently that was how her life worked now. All the important moments happened during storms. Samuel paced like a caged animal, while Margaret and Mary Brennan, who'd come to help, tended to Eleanor. The labor was long and difficult, testing Eleanor's endurance in ways nothing else had. But she thought of all the strong women who'd done this before her, all the frontier mothers who'd given birth in cabins and wagons, and sometimes in the open prairie. If they could do it, so could she. James Samuel Hayes was born as the sun rose on December 4th, his cries strong and demanding. When Margaret placed him in Eleanor's arms, she felt something shift in her chest, a fierce love that was different from anything she'd experienced before. He's perfect, Samuel whispered, tears running unashamed down his weathered face. You're perfect. This whole life is perfect. Eleanor laughed weakly, exhausted but exhilarated. Nothing's perfect. He'll keep us up nights, make messes, probably be as stubborn as both his parents combined. But he's ours, and that's better than perfect. As she nursed her son for the first time, Eleanor thought about the journey that had brought her here. From a respectable Boston schoolroom to a Wyoming ranch, from shame and exile to love and belonging, from a woman with no options to a woman who'd helped create her own destiny. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in pristine white. But inside the house was warm and full of life. Margaret cooking breakfast, Samuel unable to stop staring at his son, Mary's children, peeking around the doorway to see the new baby. What are you thinking? Samuel asked, settling carefully beside her on the bed. Eleanor looked down at James, who'd fallen asleep at her breast milk drunk and content. She thought about trying to explain the tangle of emotions, triumph and terror, exhaustion and exhilaration, the sense of ending and beginning all at once. I'm thinking about truth, she said finally. How I came here hiding from it, and you taught me to face it instead. How that first day you said I didn't have to pretend with you, and that changed everything. Samuel kissed her forehead gently. No pretending, he agreed. Just truth and work and love. Think that's enough to build a life on. Eleanor looked around the room at their son, at the man who'd become her true partner, at the snow falling outside the window of the home they'd defended and improved and made entirely theirs. More than enough, she said. It's everything. The winter that followed James's birth was the hardest yet, but Eleanor barely noticed the howling winds and mounting snow. Her world had narrowed to the warm circle of the house, to feeding schedules and tiny fingers that gripped hers with surprising strength. Samuel took on more of the outside work, leaving before dawn and returning after dark, his face weathered by cold but always softening when he looked at his son. It was February when the letter arrived that threatened to shatter everything they'd built. Jake brought it from town, his expression grim, as he handed Eleanor the envelope bearing a Boston postmark and official seal. She recognized the handwriting immediately, Mr. Thornton Whitman, headmaster of the academy, where she'd taught the man whose son had destroyed her life. Samuel was in the barn when she opened it, James sleeping in his cradle beside the warm stove. Her hands trembled as she read the formal script, each word carefully chosen for maximum impact. Richard Whitman was dead killed in a drunken brawl in a waterfront tavern. Before his death, in what Thornton Whitman described as a moment of conscience, Richard had written a confession clearing Eleanor of all wrongdoing, admitting he'd fabricated the entire scandal when she'd refused his advances. The headmaster was writing to offer Eleanor her position back with increased salary and a formal apology from the school board. Boston society, he assured her, was prepared to welcome her return with open arms. The wrongful damage to her reputation would be publicly corrected. She could resume her life as if the last 2 years had never happened. Eleanor set the letter down and looked around the kitchen at the curtains she'd sewn the preserves she'd put up last fall. Lined on shelves, Samuel had built the cradle he'd carved while she was pregnant. Through the window, she could see him working with a young horse patient and steady as always. This was her life now chosen and cherished, not something to be escaped. When Samuel came in for lunch, she showed him the letter. He read it twice, his face carefully neutral, then set it aside. "What do you want to do?" he asked simply. "What do you mean?" Eleanor asked, though she knew exactly what he meant. "It's your vindication, Eleanor. Everything you lost has been offered back. The life you were meant to have before—" He gestured vaguely at the kitchen, the ranch himself. Eleanor stood and crossed to him, taking his cold hands in hers. "Samuel Hayes, you listen to me. The life I was meant to have is the one I'm living. I didn't end up here by accident or misfortune. I ended up here because this is where I belong. Boston offers me my old cage back, gilded and apologetic, but still a cage. Here I have freedom, purpose, partnership, and love. Why would I trade that for respectability I no longer value?" The relief in his eyes made her heart ache. "You're sure?" "I'll write back today," Eleanor said firmly, thanking them for the vindication but declining their offer. "Though I might mention that my husband owns one of the most successful ranches in Wyoming territory and that I'm co-owner of said ranch, just so they understand I didn't just survive their attempt to destroy me, I thrived." Samuel laughed, pulling her close. "That's my Eleanor. Never miss a chance to teach someone a lesson." She wrote the letter that afternoon while James nursed, choosing her words carefully. She thanked Thornton Whitman for the vindication, but explained that she'd found her calling in the West, teaching not in a classroom but through life itself. She mentioned the ranch's success, her marriage to a respected landowner, her son, who would inherit a legacy of hard work and honesty rather than Boston propriety. But the letter she sent to Mrs. Adelaide Morrison, her only true friend from Boston, who'd written occasionally despite the scandal, was more honest. "I wake each morning to mountains instead of buildings." She wrote to the sound of cattle instead of carriages. "My hands are rough from work, my skin brown from sun, my body strong from labor. I've delivered calves, faced down gunmen, survived blizzards, and built a life from determination and partnership. I wouldn't trade a single callus or scar for all the tea parties and literary salons in Boston." Spring arrived late that year, but when it came, it brought abundance. The cattle prices remained high. The garden Eleanor had planned all winter promised to be their best yet, and James grew strong and healthy, already showing his father's steady temperament and his mother's keen observation of the world around him. It was during spring roundup that they had an unexpected visitor. A well-dressed man arrived from Chicago, representing a group of investors interested in buying beef directly from ranchers, cutting out the middlemen who took significant profits. He'd heard about the Double H through their banker, who'd mentioned Samuel and Eleanor Hayes as educated progressive ranchers who might be interested in new business arrangements. "Most ranchers I approach can barely read the contracts," Mr. Davidson admitted over dinner. "But I understand you're both educated, Mrs. Hayes particularly, that you kept a school here." "I did," Eleanor confirmed. "Education matters even on the frontier, perhaps especially on the frontier where knowledge can mean the difference between success and failure." The deal they negotiated would guarantee premium prices for their beef for the next 3 years, with potential for expansion if quality standards were met. Eleanor handled the contract negotiations, her experience with legal documents proving invaluable, while Samuel's expertise ensured they could meet the practical requirements. "You're quite the partnership," Davidson observed as they finalized arrangements. "I've never seen a couple work together so seamlessly, each contributing different but essential skills." That summer brought another change. The collective that had bought the triple bar approached Samuel about managing the combined lands. Not owning they'd retain their individual properties, but coordinating efforts for everyone's benefit. It would mean more work, but also more income and influence. "You should do it," Eleanor encouraged. "You have the respect of every rancher in the valley now. They trust you to be fair." "It would mean more time away from home," Samuel warned. "More meetings, more politics, less time with you and James." Eleanor considered this, watching their son attempt to crawl across the kitchen floor with determined inefficiency. "Then we make it work differently. The meetings happen here when possible. I attend as your partner, not your wife sitting silently in the corner. We shape this role to fit our life, not the other way around." And that's what they did. The Double H became the unofficial center of Valley cooperation. Eleanor turned the main room into a meeting space when needed, serving coffee and food that kept discussion civil and productive. She contributed ideas about crop rotation, market timing, and resource sharing that the men initially resisted but gradually came to value. James learned to walk that fall, taking his first steps during a heated discussion about water rights. The room full of tough ranchers went silent, watching the baby totter from his mother to his father, and something shifted in the atmosphere. This wasn't just about their individual survival anymore. It was about the future, about what they'd leave for the next generation. "We need a school," Eleanor announced, seizing the moment. "A real school, with a proper teacher, regular hours, and supplies. Our children deserve better than sporadic lessons when we can spare them from chores." The idea faced resistance. Schools cost money. Required commitment meant acknowledging the valley was becoming more than a collection of isolated ranches. But Eleanor persisted, using skills learned in Boston's political educational circles. She organized the women, first knowing they'd convince their husbands more effectively than she could. By Christmas of 1875, the Willow Creek Valley School was under construction, built with donated labor and materials from every ranch in the area. Eleanor would teach until they could afford to hire someone with Anne Brennan as her assistant. The school would serve not just the valley children, but would become a symbol of their evolution from mere survival to actual community. That Christmas was magical in ways their first together couldn't have been. The house was full. Margaret had come to stay. The Brennans joined them for dinner. Even Jake abandoned his usual solitary habits to share the celebration. James, now a year old, was walking confidently and beginning to form words, his favorite being horse, which came out more like hoss, but delighted Samuel endlessly. Eleanor stood in her kitchen, watching the controlled chaos of people she'd come to love, and marveled at the transformation. 2 years ago, she'd arrived with nothing but desperate hope. Now she was the center of a growing family, a respected voice in the community, a successful rancher's partner in every sense. "You're thinking deep thoughts," Samuel observed, coming up behind her, James on his hip. "I'm thinking about time," Eleanor replied. "How 2 years can feel like a lifetime when they're full of real living. In Boston, decades passed where nothing really changed except the fashions. Here, every season brings growth challenge change." The winter of 1876 started mild, leading to complacency. When the real cold hit in February, it came with a vengeance. A 3-day blizzard trapped them in the house, snow drifting higher than the windows. The temperature dropped so low that even with the stoves burning constantly, ice formed on the inside walls. They lost a dozen cattle frozen where they stood. Jake nearly lost 2 fingers to frostbite trying to save them. The well froze solid, requiring them to melt snow for water. James developed a frightening cough that had Eleanor sitting up nights, holding him upright so he could breathe easier. But they survived, as they always did, through cooperation and determination. When the weather broke, neighbors appeared with supplies and help. The doctor from town made the dangerous journey to check on James, pronouncing him recovering well. The community that Eleanor had helped forge proved its worth in crisis. Spring brought recovery and renewal. The school opened officially in April, with 15 students ranging from age 5 to 16. Eleanor structured lessons to accommodate the varied ages and abilities, using older students to help teach younger ones, creating a collaborative environment that mirrored the ranch cooperation. She taught reading and arithmetic, of course, but also practical skills. How to read contracts, calculate interest, write business letters. She brought in guest instructors. Mrs. Chen taught basic Chinese and cooking. The new bank clerk explained financial systems. Even Samuel gave lessons on animal husbandry and weather prediction. "You're not just teaching them to read," Mary Brennan observed, watching her daughter Anne help younger students with their letters. "You're teaching them to think, to question, to expect more from life than their parents did." "Is that wrong?" Eleanor asked suddenly, uncertain. "Am I giving them dreams that can't be fulfilled out here?" "No," Mary said firmly. "You're giving them tools to build whatever dreams they choose. That's the greatest gift anyone can offer." The summer of 1876 was significant. For another reason, it marked the centennial of American independence. Willow Creek organized a celebration that brought people from 100 miles around. There were horse races, shooting contests, a barn dance that lasted until dawn. Eleanor organized a children's recitation of the Declaration of Independence, their young voices carrying across the gathered crowd, speaking words of freedom and self-determination that resonated deeply with people who'd chosen the frontier life. Samuel won the horse race, his careful training of a young stallion paying off. Eleanor won the pie contest, though she suspected sympathy votes played a part. Everyone knew the story of the Boston lady who had made herself into a rancher's wife. James, now talking in full sentences, charmed everyone by toddling up to the territorial governor who'd come for the celebration and announcing, "My mama teaches school and my papa raises cows." But beneath the celebration lay tensions. The country was changing, railroads pushing further west, bringing easier transportation, but also new pressures. Indian conflicts to the north had everyone nervous. Political corruption in Washington filtered down to territorial administration. The frontier was closing slowly but inevitably. "Progress, Chartis," Samuel said with distaste one evening, reading about plans for a railroad spur that would come within 50 miles of Willow Creek. "They call it progress, but what it really means is the end of what we've built here." "Not the end," Eleanor corrected, looking up from where she was helping James practice writing his name. "Change, yes, but we've proven we can adapt. We've already evolved from isolated ranches to a cooperative community. We can evolve again." That evolution came sooner than expected. In August, a group of Eastern investors arrived interested in establishing a cattle company that would consolidate smaller ranches into a massive operation. They offered astronomical sums, enough money for any family to retire in comfort. The ranchers met at the Double H to discuss the offer. Arguments raged through the night. Some wanted to take the money and run others to fight any change. Still others suggested negotiating for better terms. "What they're offering isn't just money," Eleanor pointed out during a lull in the shouting. "They're offering us obsolescence. They want our land, our water, our years of knowledge, but not us. We become employees on land we once owned, or we leave entirely. Either way, what we've built, this community, this way of life, dies." "Then what do you suggest?" Tom Brennan asked. He'd recovered fully from his shooting, but carried his arm differently now, a permanent reminder of Hartley's violence. "We can't match their money. We can't stop progress." Eleanor stood commanding attention the way she once had in a classroom. "We don't match them, we become them. We incorporate ourselves. The Willow Creek Cattle Cooperative, legally structured with shares based on current holdings, but decisions made collectively. We maintain individual ranch ownership, but pool resources for negotiation and sales. We become big enough to deal with the eastern markets, directly cutting out these investors entirely." The silence that followed was profound. What she was suggesting was revolutionary ranchers were independent by nature, suspicious of anything that resembled corporate structure. But they'd learned to trust Eleanor's intelligence and Samuel's integrity. "It could work," Jake said slowly. "If we did it right, kept local control, made sure no one person could dominate like Hartley tried to." The discussion continued past midnight, but by dawn they'd agreed in principle. Eleanor would research the legal structures, Samuel would coordinate the practical integration, and they'd spend the fall convincing holdouts and working out details. The incorporation papers were filed in September 1876, making the Willow Creek Cattle Cooperative one of the first of its kind in the territory. Eleanor was listed as secretary-treasurer, an almost unheard-of position for a woman, but no one questioned it. They'd seen her handle the books, negotiate contracts, and face down threats. Gender seemed irrelevant compared to competence. That Christmas, Eleanor realized she was pregnant again.
The knowledge came with mixed emotions, joy at expanding their family worry about managing increased responsibilities and a deep satisfaction that this child would be born into a stable, prosperous situation so different from James's arrival into uncertainty. A daughter this time, she told Samuel with baseless certainty. Someone to carry on what we've started here to show that women can be partners, not just passengers. And if it's another son, Samuel asked, amused by her confidence, then we'll raise him to respect women as equals, to see partnership as natural, to understand that strength comes in many forms. The winter was mild, allowing Eleanor to continue teaching until March. Her students had progressed remarkably. Several of the older ones were ready for advanced texts she'd ordered from Chicago. Anne Brennan had developed into an excellent assistant teacher and would take over fully when Eleanor needed to rest. The cooperative's first year proved successful beyond their wildest hopes. By pooling resources, they'd negotiated prices 15% higher than individual sales would have brought. The shared knowledge improved everyone's operations. Eleanor's detailed record-keeping became the standard. Samuel's breeding program improved the entire valley's stock. Innovation spread quickly rather than being hoarded. Margaret Hayes had become a permanent fixture, her initial visits extending until it seemed silly for her to maintain her townhouse. She took over much of the household management, freeing Eleanor for teaching and cooperative business. The relationship between the two women had evolved from wary respect to genuine affection, bonded by their shared love for Samuel and James, and their mutual understanding of women's hidden strengths. I was wrong about Sarah being perfect for Samuel, Margaret admitted one evening as they prepared dinner together. I thought he needed someone delicate to protect someone who'd make him feel strong. I didn't understand he needed someone strong enough to stand beside him, to challenge him, to grow with him. Sarah was who he needed then, Eleanor replied generously. Young love's simple and sweet, but second chances require different things: wisdom, partnership, the ability to build, rather than just dream. Martha Eleanor Hayes was born on a clear morning in May 1877, her arrival easier than her brother's, as if she knew her place in the world was already secure. She had her mother's red hair and her father's steady gaze, and from the first moment she owned everyone who saw her. James was fascinated by his sister, spending hours watching her sleep, offering her his precious wooden horse, explaining the world to her in his serious 3-year-old way. This is our ranch, he'd tell her solemnly. Papa and Mama built it strong. Someday we'll make it stronger. The school's success had attracted attention from the Territorial Education Board. They offered Eleanor an official position as superintendent for the region, overseeing the establishment of schools in other valleys. It would mean travel meetings, involvement in territorial politics, everything she'd once thought she wanted. She declined without hesitation. My work is here, she explained to the surprised official who'd made the offer. This valley, these people, this life. I'm not interested in administering education from a distance. I want to see my students' faces, know their families watch them grow. But she did agree to write a guide for establishing frontier schools, drawing on her experiences. The pamphlet Education at the Edge, a practical guide for frontier teachers, became widely distributed, earning Eleanor a small but satisfying fame among educational circles. The summer of 1877 brought challenges in the form of drought. Water became precious, requiring careful management and cooperation. The creek that ran through the Double H proved crucial, and Samuel's generous water-sharing policies cemented his position as the valley's unofficial leader. It was during this drought that Thomas Hartley returned, not in person, but through a letter delivered by his lawyer. He was dying cancer eating away at him in a Boston hospital, and he wanted to make amends. The letter contained a full confession of his crimes, the intimidation, the moved boundary markers ordering Tom Brennan's shooting. He also included a bank draft for $5,000 compensation for damage done. Eleanor and Samuel discussed it at length. The money could do significant good, expand the school, improve the cooperative's infrastructure, provide emergency funds for struggling families. But taking it felt like accepting blood money. We use it for the community, Eleanor finally decided. Not for us, but for everyone he hurt. We create a fund for families in crisis, for young people starting out, for improvements that benefit everyone. We transform his guilt into something constructive.
The Willow Creek Community Fund was established that fall with Eleanor as one of 3 trustees. The first grant went to a young couple starting a ranch on marginal land, the second to medical supplies for the area's new doctor, the third to books for the school library. Hartley's attempt at absolution became a foundation for future growth. Christmas 1877 was the most elaborate yet. The cooperative's success meant everyone had money for gifts and special foods. The school children performed a nativity play Eleanor had written, featuring shepherds who sounded suspiciously like cowboys and wise men who discussed cattle prices. Martha, 8 months old, played baby Jesus, sleeping through the entire performance despite the chaos around her. 5 years ticked. Samuel marveled that night as they prepared for bed, children finally asleep, house quiet. 5 years since you stepped off that stagecoach in tears. 5 years since you offered me your handkerchief and told me I didn't have to pretend. Eleanor replied, moving into his arms. Best 5 years of my life. Even with all the hardship, the threats, the storms, the constant work, especially with those, they proved what we could do together, what we could build from honesty and partnership. I wouldn't change a single moment. They made love with the comfortable passion of a couple who knew each other deeply, whose bodies had learned to move together through seasons of tenderness and desire. Afterward, lying in the darkness, Eleanor thought about the woman who'd fled Boston in disgrace. That woman had been educated but naive, principled but untested, full of theoretical knowledge but lacking practical wisdom. The frontier had burned away everything unnecessary, leaving someone stronger, clearer, more essentially herself than she'd ever imagined possible. I love you, she told Samuel, words worn smooth by repetition but no less meaningful. I love the life we've built, the children we've made, the community we've helped create. I love who I've become with you. You've become who you always were. Samuel replied, his voice drowsy but certain. The frontier just revealed it. That strength, that courage, that brilliant mind, they were always there. You just needed space to let them grow. Outside, snow began to fall, the first of the season, gentle and quiet. The Double H Ranch slept beneath its white blanket, secure and prosperous home to a family that had chosen each other and a partnership that had transformed a valley. Eleanor rose quietly and went to check on the children. James had kicked off his blankets as usual, and she tucked them back around him. Martha slept peacefully in her cradle, one tiny fist pressed against her cheek. These children would grow up taking for granted things Eleanor had fought to achieve, that women could be partners, that education mattered everywhere, that community was stronger than isolation. She stood at the window looking out at the snow-covered land that had become more home than Boston ever was. In the barn, she could see a light Jake checking on a sick calf, perpetually vigilant. In the distance, other ranch lights twinkled, families she'd come to know and love, a community bound by shared struggle and mutual support. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The cooperative faced pressure from larger cattle companies, the school needed expansion, there were always fences to mend and animals to tend. Martha would need feeding at dawn, James would want to help with chores despite being too small for most of them. Samuel would head out to check the cattle, and Eleanor would balance teaching with accounting with motherhood with the 1,000 other demands of ranch life. But tonight, in this moment, everything was perfect. Not the false perfection she'd once sought in Boston, all surface and no substance, but the real perfection of a life fully lived. She'd found her truth not in respectability, but in respect earned through action. She'd found her strength not in protection, but in partnership. She'd found her home not in the place she was born, but in the place she'd chosen to build. The snow continued to fall, and Eleanor returned to bed, to Samuel's warmth, to the life they'd created from nothing but determination and trust. As sleep claimed her, her last thought was of that first day standing on the platform with tears on her face, convinced her life was ending. How wrong she'd been. It had just been beginning.